The Willys MB and the Ford GPW, both formerly called the U.S. Army Truck, 1 4-ton, 4x4, command reconnaissance, commonly known as the Willys Jeep NB4 Jeep, or Jeep 12 and sometimes referred to by its standard Army vehicle supply NRG 503 NB5, were highly successful American off-road capable, light military utility vehicles. Well over 600,000 were built to a single standardized design, for the United States and the Allied forces in World War II, from 1941 until 1945. This also made it, by its light weight, the world's first mass-produced four-wheel drive car, built in six-figure numbers. The 1 4-ton Jeep became the primary light-wheeled, multi-role vehicle of the United States military and its allies, with President Eisenhower once calling it one of three decisive weapons the U.S. had during World War II. 13 with some 640,000 units built NB7, the 1 4-ton Jeeps constituted a quarter of the total military support motor vehicles that the U.S. produced during the war. NB8 and almost two-thirds of the 988,000 light 4WD vehicles produced, when counted together with the Dodge WC series. Large numbers of Jeeps were provided to U.S. allies, including the Soviet Union at the time. Aside from large amounts of 112 and 212-ton trucks, and 25,000 3-4-ton Dodges, some 50,000 1 4-ton Jeeps were shipped to help Russia during World War II, against Nazi Germany's total production of just over 50,000 Kubelwagens, the Jeep's primary counterpart. Historian Charles K. Hyde wrote, "In many respects, the Jeep became the iconic vehicle of World War II, with an almost mythological reputation of toughness, durability, and versatility." 14 Not only did it become the workhorse of the American military, literally replacing the use of horses and other draft animals, still heavily used in World War I, but also motorcycles, and sidecars, in every role, from messaging and cavalry units to supply trains. But improvised field modifications also made the Jeep capable of just about any other function soldiers could think of. 17 Moreover, military Jeeps were adopted by countries all over the world, to this day so much that they have become the most widely used and recognizable military vehicle in history. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe in World War II, wrote in his memoirs that most senior officers regarded it as one of the 5 pieces of equipment most vital to success in Africa and Europe. NB9 General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army during the war, called the vehicle America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. 2021-22 In 1991, the MB Jeep was designated an International Historic Mechanical Engineering Landmark by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. After World War II, the original Jeep continued to serve, in the Korean War and other conflicts, until it was updated in the form of the M38 Willys MC and M38A1 Willys MD, in 1949 and 1952 respectively, and received a complete redesign by Ford in the form of the 1960 introduced M151 Jeep. Its influence, however, was much greater than that. Manufacturers around the world began building Jeeps and similar designs, either under license or not, at first primarily for military purposes, but later also for the civilian market. Willys turned the MB into the civilian Jeep CJ2A in 1945, making the world's first mass-produced civilian four-wheel drive. The Jeep name was trademarked, and grew into a successful, and highly valued brand. The success of the Jeep inspired both an entire category of recreational 4WDs and SUVs, making four-wheel drive a household term, and numerous incarnations of military light utility vehicles. In 2010, the American Enterprise Institute called the Jeep one of the most influential designs in automotive history. Its sardine tin on wheels silhouette and slotted grille are perhaps even more instantly recognizable than the VW Beetle or the Mini, and it has evolved into the currently produced Jeep Wrangler, still largely resembling the original Jeep design. A 1941 Bantam achieving total liftoff, loaded with 3-man crew, and towing a 37mm anti-tank gun. Flying Jeep photos like this one inspired posters and perhaps the Leaping Lena nickname. History. The design challenge and achievement. Bantam's first prototype, shown in front of the already new for 1940 light half-ton, 4x4 Dodge VC1 command car, graphically shows the radically new 1/4-ton concept. By 1940, U.S. policies had caused a stark disadvantage compared to Nazi Germany's aim, building a standard fleet of Wehrmacht, German armed forces, motor vehicles. From 1933, German industry could only produce Wehrmacht-approved trucks. 24 The U.S. quartermaster's only significant success for standardization, through late September 1939 Army regulations on tactical trucks NB-10 was that the War Department limited procurement to just 5 payload chassis types, categories, from 1 2-ton to 7 plus 1 2-ton 25 but only models produced commercially by 2 or more competing companies. The Army was still to use commercially standard trucks and parts, with only minor modifications, like brush guards, tow hooks, etc. 24 specially designed vehicles or a standardized truck fleet were still ruled out. 25 This policy was intended to assure speedy production at the outbreak of war, regardless of the maintenance and spare parts problems that might develop later. 25 The new rules more or less allowed the Army to order in late 1939 the U.S. military's first ever light, quantity-produced 4x4 trucks, the half-ton Dodge G505 VC series trucks, delivered in the first half of 1940, but these were still not light enough for the jobs that both the infantry and ordnance branches required it for. 26 27 28 By contrast, Germany had already completed a development program to produce off-road-capable standardized military vehicles, the Einheitsbkw der Wehrmacht, from 1933 to 1938, which had already yielded a fleet of tens of thousands of standardized vehicles for the German Army. 24 Moreover, lessons were learned, and a second program to develop a cheap, light, nimble multipurpose off-roader, the Volkswagen Kübelwagen, had already started in 1938. America's military faced a severe catch-up situation, both in time and knowledge. In June 1940, the race was on to produce a lightweight, four-wheel-drive cross-country vehicle for the U.S. Army, capable of carrying equipment and personnel across rough terrain. The idea of the Jeep originated with the infantry, which needed a low-profile, powerful vehicle with four-wheel drive, and it was turned over to commercial companies, chiefly Bantam, Willys, and Ford, to deliver the development, repeatedly being described as a design by committee. 29-30-31 In fall 1941, Lieutenant E. P. Hogan of the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps wrote, "Credit for the original design of the Army's truck 1/4-ton, 4x4, may not be claimed by any single individual or manufacturer. This vehicle is the result of much research and many tests." 32 Hogan credited both military and civilian engineers, especially those working at the Holabird Quartermaster Depot. Nevertheless, Willys advertising and branding during and after the war aimed to make the world recognize Willys as the creator of the Jeep. 33 When Willys first applied to trademark the Jeep name in February 1943, 34 Bantam, Ford and other companies objected, because of their contributions to the Jeep and the war effort. Although many other companies advertised their patriotic efforts to producing the 1/4-ton Jeeps, including Ford, featuring their own GPW Jeeps in their ads, nobody took their claims as far as Willys Overland, and the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, FTC, opened a case, charging Willys Overland with misrepresentation in their advertising and news claims. On May 6, 1943, 35 According to the New York Times, the FTC ruled that Willys did not perform the spectacular achievement NB-12 of creating, designing and perfecting the Jeep together with U.S. Army quartermaster officers, but that the idea of creating a Jeep was said by the FTC to have been originated by the American Bantam Co. of Butler, PA, with U.S. Army officers, and to have been conceived and developed by that company. Willys appealed this ruling, and after a 5-year investigation, in 1948 the FTC again ruled that Willys was unfairly taking credit for the creation and was thus using unfair methods of competition. The FTC ordered Willys to stop claiming they were the sole creator of the Jeep. Some 70 years later, in a late 2012 article, the Defense Acquisition Research Journal NB13 still called the Jeep design a product of a massive team effort, including all three manufacturers as well as Army engineers, both military and civilian. 37. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, here in his Jeep in summer 1944, wrote that the Jeep was one of the 6 most vital U.S. vehicles to win the war. Moreover, in 2015, the Pennsylvania General Assembly unanimously adopted a non-controversial House Resolution, 382, commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Bantam Jeep, invented and originally manufactured in Butler, Pennsylvania, 38, therein explicitly resolving that the American Bantam Car Co. of Butler, PA, invented the Jeep, calling it one of the most famous vehicles in the world, were the only party to deliver a working prototype of a light 4-wheel drive reconnaissance car. Within the required 7 weeks, which withstood 30 days of Army testing at Camp Holabird, then further developed that car, and manufactured 2,675 Jeeps, before losing further production contracts to Willys and Ford Motor Company, for fear that Bantam would not be able to ramp up production to 75 Jeeps a day, and after the Army handed Ford and Willys the blueprints of Bantam's detailed technical drawings, though Bantam proved highly capable and productive during the war, entrusted with manufacturing torpedo motors and more. However, on April 7, 1942, U.S. Patent 227-8450 for the World War II Jeep, titled Military Vehicle Body, had been awarded to the U.S. Army, which had applied for it, listing Colonel Byron Q. Jones as the inventor on the patent, though he had performed no work on the design of the vehicle. 39 filed on October 8, 1941, stating in the application that the invention described herein, if patented, may be manufactured and used by or for the government for governmental purposes without the payment of any royalty thereon. 40 The patent relates to a small car vehicle body having convertible features whereby it is rendered particularly desirable for military purposes, and describes the purpose as being a convertible small car body so arranged that a single vehicle may be interchangeably used as a cargo truck, personnel carrier, emergency ambulance, field beds, radio car, trench mortar unit, mobile anti-aircraft machine gun unit, or for other purposes. First motorizations and World War I. For centuries, horses were used for reconnaissance, communications, and pulling loads, whenever wars were fought, but after the start of the 20th century, motorcycles were the first motor vehicles eagerly adopted by the military, either to replace mounted/ridden cavalry horses, or to motorize infantry. The armies of World War I relied on marching men, horses, and railways for movement, but its new technologies introduced motor vehicles, the first tanks, armored car, and artillery tractors. Motorcycles were the most prolific motor tools in the Allied arsenal. 1917 Indian-U.S. motorcycle and sidecar, with M1914 Colt machine gun. British military motorcycle dispatch rider, 1914 World War I. Cavalry, mounted infantry, scouts, and messengers could now be mobilized in combat with much greater speed, agility, and near-tireless machines. 42 Exactly what was wanted for relaying critical orders, getting munitions to machine guns, and scouting miles ahead of advancing units. The quick and nimble motorcycle, ridden hard through shot and shell to secure victory, has made itself irreplaceable in specific roles on the battlefield to this day. But motorcycles also had serious limitations. One could be fast on a decent road, but many roads were still so bad, that the U.S. already had a good roads movement in the late 19th century, as increased usage of bicycles required improving the surfaces of existing wagon and carriage trails. The motorcycles of the era were not ideal, only the best motorcyclists could endure a muddy battlefield trail, control the bike and keep it from stalling, damage, or flipping over, and driver training was both costly in terms of time and money. 43-41 They had poor off-roading ability and lacked payload capacity. Adding a sidecar provided more stability, but payload and cargo space remained very limited, and having only one powered wheel out of 3, still meant the combination got stuck a lot. Royal Page Davidson used patents of Charles Duryea to modify chassis with machine guns and armor shield, from 1898. Colonel Davidson Anti-Aircraft Semi-Armored Cadillac, 1909. A convoy of 4x4 US FWD trucks in a mud and ruts road, 1916 Mexican Expedition Note FWD logo on grille. Nash Quad 2-ton ammunitions truck, 1918. At the same time, the arrival and growing use of automobiles led to various individuals pioneering vehicle trips across the U.S., followed by the first transcontinental trips by convoys of vehicles. After the U.S. Army purchased its first truck in 1907, of 5-ton payload capacity 44 in the late summer of 1913, the Army Medical and Quartermaster Corps, QC, took a 3-4-ton QC field truck, on a 922 miles, 1,484 kilometers, multi-leg experimental trek through Alaska for the state's road commission, both to try the truck's bad road supply and maintenance abilities as well as test the state of several important overland connections in the rough territory. 1915 followed the first successful transcontinental motor convoy, traveling the entire Lincoln Highway, from New York City to the Panama Pacific World Exhibition in San Francisco, taking 4 months for making a film about it. Starting in 1916, the Quartermaster Corps was servicing over 100 motor trucks, of as many as 27 varieties, and in March that year, the U.S. Army decided to form its first 2 motor companies, to be used immediately in the Pancho Villa expedition in Mexico 44 starting March 14, 1916. One company got 27 four-wheel drive, 2-ton, Jeffrey off-road quad trucks. The other got 27 heavy-duty, 112-ton, long-wheelbase, rear-wheel drive white trucks. 44 The U.S. War Department procured the vehicles as rolling chassis, which the manufacturers had to expedite to El Paso, Texas. The wagon bodies for the chassis came from the Quartermaster Depot. The most suitable truck capacity found by the Quartermaster General for Army use to be 112-ton, matching both the country roads' nature, the strength of bridges, as well as the existing troop supply system, at the time also using standard 112-ton, 4-mule wagons. Meanwhile, World War I had been raging in Europe since 1914. More than 5 years before, Henry Ford had launched his Model T. Its speed, durability, stamina, and ease of maintenance, compared to a horse, had already won over many civilians. 46 and British and French forces also wanted them. Ford, an isolationist, would not sign a contract with an overseas government, but local dealers sold over 50,000 Fords to European forces, who militarized them locally, most famously into ambulances. 46 When the U.S. entered the war in 1917, Ford sold directly to his country, delivering another 15,000 cars before peace was signed. Britain, France, and Russia were already buying American-made four-wheel drive trucks from the Four-Wheel Drive Auto Company, and Jeffrey/Nash quads, because on the muddy roads and European battlefields, they would not get stuck all the time. The United States procured thousands of motor vehicles for its military, including some 12,800 Dodges 48 plus thousands of four-wheel drive trucks, 112-ton Nash quads, and 3 and 5-ton FWD trucks. General John J. Pershing viewed horses and mules as acceptable for the previous 3 U.S. wars, but in the new century, his cavalry forces had to move quicker, with more range and more personnel. 49 He was the first to deploy motorcycles, in the Mexican Border War, predominantly a cavalry campaign over wide regions of the Southwest, where Harley-Davidson motorcycles provided to the Army gave the U.S. the advantage over the horse-mounted Mexicans. 41 The U.S. Army was so pleased with further innovations, like a sidecar as a platform to mount machine guns, that the U.S. procured many more motorcycles than 4WD trucks for World War I. Entire infantry units were mobilized on motorcycles, and they also provided an ideal way to rapidly deploy machine gun crews into position. Medical units used them to evacuate wounded on stretcher-equipped sidecars, and to return medical supplies and ammunition. By the end of the war, the whole world saw the horse as hopelessly outclassed. 46 Nevertheless, crucially, using four-wheel drive still remained tied to heavier trucks, of 112-ton to 5-ton capacity. All through World War I, there were not any light four-wheel drive vehicles yet. Interbellum tests, and formulating the need for a standardized, 4x4, quarter-ton interwar experimental vehicles. 1923 Ford 4x2 reconnaissance car, much tested for cross-country mobility. USMC converted 1929 half-ton, 4x2 Chevrolet, armed Scout one-off. Marmon Harrington converted Ford half-ton truck, c. 1936, sometimes called the grandfather of the Jeep. Howie Wiley machine gun carrier, 1937, Fort Benning Infantry School. 1938 Marmon Harrington 4x4 Ford reconnaissance car with 2.30 caliber machine guns. Immediately after World War I, the further and future use of motor vehicles was considered. In many roles, motorized vehicles had successfully replaced horses and other draft animals, but several roles remained that required better or more specialized vehicles. In 1919 already, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps recommended the acquisition of a new kind of military vehicle, of lightweight and compact size, with a low silhouette and high ground clearance, and possess the ability to carry weapons and men over all sorts of rough terrain. 53 The U.S. Army started looking for a small vehicle suited for reconnaissance and messaging, while at the same time searching for a light cross-country weapons carrier. However, after World War I, the United States had a big public debt, and the military had masses of leftover war vehicles, so vehicle budgets were drastically cut. During the first half of the interwar period, the Roaring Twenties, despite a booming economy, United States non-interventionism and neutrality policies were supported by both elite and popular opinion, to the point of isolationism, and no real budgets were allocated. Then, the Wall Street crash of 1929, and the following Great Depression resulted in economic austerity policies lasting until the end of the 1930s, thus curtailing any development of new military vehicles, like a light 4WD car. At the same time, there was a drive for standardization. By the end of World War I, U.S. forces overseas had a total of 216 different makes and models of motor vehicles to operate, both foreign and domestic, and no good supply system to keep them running. Various light motor vehicles were tested at first, motorcycles with and without sidecars, and some modified Ford Model Ts 55-56, but what was needed was a very light, small, battlefield utility vehicle to replace motorcycles, with or without sidecar, more user-friendly to control 50 but just as easy to get in and out of. In the early 1930s, the U.S. Army experimented with a bantamweight midget truck for scouts and raiders. A 1,050 pounds, 480 kilograms, low-slung minicar with a pickup body, provided by American Austin Car Company 57, was shown in a 1933 article in Popular Mechanics magazine 58. One of the pictures showed that the vehicle was light enough to be manhandled. 4 soldiers could lift it from the ground entirely. But it was still only rear-wheel drive. After 1935, when the U.S. Congress declared World War I vehicles obsolete, procurement for remotorization of the Army gained more traction. 25 But pre-war, peacetime budget restrictions still meant that the U.S. Comptroller General imposed open bidding on every additional, or even incremental procurement. Each time, the Army was forced to award the contract to the lowest bid that met requirements and specifications, 59 often different makers. However, saving a small percentage initially, on the procurement, overall proved penny-wise, pound-foolish, because it led to problematic diversity of the fleet, requiring too much training of operators and mechanics for maintenance and repairs, and an unmanageably large supply of non-interchangeable spare parts. The commanding officer at Halliburton reported in 1935 that, the 360 different models of vehicles now in the Army, involve nearly 1 million items of spare parts which neither the War Department nor any other authority can control. 24 This was bad for logistics in times of war, both in terms of supply chains, as well as hindering troops' mobility by blocking the ability to repair one vehicle by scavenging parts off another. And the Army could still only get multi-axle drive on tactical trucks, requiring the greatest battlefield mobility. Japan fielded 1935 Kurogain Type 95 4x4 Scout car, captured at the 1939 Battle of Khalkhin Gol. Meanwhile, in Asia and the Pacific, Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931 and was at war with China from 1937. Its Imperial Army used a small, 2,425 pounds, 1,100 kilograms, 3-man crew, 4-wheel drive car for reconnaissance and troop movements, the Kurogain Type 95, produced in limited numbers from 1936. In 1937 Marmon Harrington presented 5 4x4 Fords, an American Bantam, previously American Austin, once again contributed delivering 3 Austin-derived roadsters in 1938. 52 The U.S. Army itself had also built an experimental light, low-profile scout and gun mover, the Howie Wiley machine gun carrier, ordered by General Walter Short, then Assistant Commander of the Army's Infantry School at Fort Benning, Georgia, and built by Captain Robert G. Howie and Master Sergeant Melvin C. Wiley. Completed in April 1937, with the driver and a gunner laying prone, operating a .30 caliber machine gun, the vehicle was nicknamed the Belly Flopper. In France, the project has already been developed and put into production since 1937. The Lafley V15 can be considered the French Jeep. 1,200 of these four-wheeled vehicles were produced before the debacle of 1940. By 1939, the U.S. Army began standardizing its general-purpose truck chassis types by payload rating, initially in 5 classes from 1.2 to 7 plus 1.2 short tons, 0.45 to 6.80 tons. The Quartermaster Corps saw that the Army needed truck chassis to be standardized in crucial basic functional types, body models, and within payload capacity classes. Additionally, some crucial features could not be equipped by the QC to commercial trucks after procurement. Cross-country capabilities, like increased ground clearance and multi-axle drive, had to be designed and built into the trucks from the factory. 59 The Quartermaster Corps Technical Committee concurred, and in June 1939 requested the Chief of Staff's approval, to start standardizing truck chassis and bodies procured for the Army into 5 payload classes, 1 2-ton, 1 1-2-ton, 2 1-2-ton, 4-ton, and 7 1-2-ton, and all tactical trucks had to have, part-time, all-wheel drive capability. 59 Furthermore, to achieve the needed level of standardization, the Quartermaster General urged trucks should be bought en masse from there on. Acting Chief of Staff, George C. Marshall, approved the procurement policy in the summer of 1939. The Quartermaster Corps also wanted to require the truck industry to use dimensionally interchangeable components, but further standardization measures were not approved until 1940. However, in 1940, the Army revised the categories. For the first time, a quarter-ton truck tactical, 4x4, chassis class was introduced, at the bottom of the range, and the 1 2-ton chassis was supplanted by a 3 4-ton payload class. By the eve of entering World War II, the United States Department of War had determined it needed a 1 4-ton, cross-country reconnaissance vehicle. Although 1 2-ton 4x4s had outperformed 1 plus 1 2-ton 4x4 trucks during testing in 1938. 63 The half-ton 4x4 trucks both from Marmon Harrington Ford, and the 1940 Dodge VC series still proved too large and heavy, and insufficiently agile off-road. 26-27 Anxious to have a quarter-ton truck in time for America's entry into World War II, the U.S. Army solicited proposals from domestic automobile manufacturers. Recognizing the need to create standard specifications, the Army formalized its requirements on July 11, 1940, and submitted them to 135 U.S. automotive manufacturers. Citation needed. Development start. Bantam reconnaissance car. In the early 1930s, the Infantry Board at Fort Benning had become interested in the British Army's use of the tiny Austin 7 car in a reconnaissance role, and in 1933 received a car from the American Austin Car Company in Pennsylvania, which built them under license. Ever since then, their devout on-the-road salesman and, Washington, lobbyist, ex-military Harry Payne kept approaching many U.S. Army and defense branches and officers, hoping to sell the idea of a small, lightweight reconnaissance car to someone Army or defense, getting some much-needed government contract business for his company. And Payne kept pushing while American Austin had gone bankrupt and its assets were reincorporated into American Bantam 5 in 1938. American Bantam again loaned 3 much improved cars to the Pennsylvania National Guard for trials during summer maneuvers, which were received as reliable, economical, and practical. 10. During the first days of September 1939, World War II had escalated in Europe, with Hitler's invasion of Poland, and the Nazi German forces showed the world a new, highly mobile form of warfare, dubbed Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, by a coordinated combination of fast-moving tanks and motorized infantry, self-propelled, artillery, and air support. In response, President Franklin Roosevelt made an emergency proclamation on September 8, 1939. It authorized the U.S. an increase in size of both the regular Army and the National Guard. The War Department was also authorized to spend an additional $12 million on motor transport. The 1940 Dodge G505 VC series, command car shown, were the first light U.S. military 4WD vehicles, bought in production quantity NB-16 during World War II, and for years nicknamed Jeeps by the soldiers. The Army then ordered the U.S. military's first ever production quantity of light, 1-2-ton, 4x4 tactical trucks, going on 5,000 Dodge G505 VC series, which arrived by the spring of 1940. Until that point, only a few third-party aftermarket modified four-wheel drive 1-2-ton trucks, mainly Marmon Harrington-derived Fords, had been bought after 1935, for testing, but the prevailing belief amongst military higher UPS and Congress was, that all the extra four-wheel drive hardware would make any truck lighter than a 1+1 2-ton payload model, so much heavier that the weight gain would cancel out any benefits gained from adding four-wheel drive. But after the 1-2-ton 4x4 Dodges arrived, two decisions were made. Greatly more of these 1-2-ton Dodges were ordered, some 80,000 for the 1941 model year revisions, but also, in June 1940, the Army's tactical trucks payload categories were revised. For the first time, the Army introduced a quarter-ton 4x4 truck chassis class, and just above that, the 1-2-ton chassis were going to be supplanted by a 3-4-ton class. Bantam officials met with chiefs of infantry and cavalry and suggested a contract to further develop military versions of their light car. But in June 1940, as a collaboration with the Quartermaster Corps, QMC, still responsible for U.S. unarmored tactical military vehicles in 1940, the Ordnance Corps initiated a technical sub-committee for the QMC to formulate comprehensive, exact specification for this new, very lightweight, cross-country tactical vehicle, capable of carrying personnel and equipment across rough terrain. 5. The committee included the now Major Robert Howe, invited for his expertise, having actually built an ultralight prototype infantry support vehicle, officers representing the Quartermaster Corps, and the Army's using Arms 65 Infantry, Cavalry, and the 2 Coast Guard divisions, as well as civilian engineers, mainly from Camp Holabird and Bantam. To begin with, the committee sent an Army delegation including Howe, and Camp Holabird vehicle testing engineers, to Butler, Pennsylvania, to visit American Bantam's factory, being invited to an extensive demonstration there, to evaluate their compact cars and production facilities. 66. Once there, Howe stayed several days, and also Robert Brown, a Camp Holabird civilian engineer, who was instructed to disregard the presentation, but changed his mind after seeing it. Brown also stayed at the Bantam plant where both Howe and he worked out specifications with Christ for the proposed vehicle. Initial 1-4-ton truck specifications, Ordnance Technical Committee, 1940. By the end of June 1940, with American Bantam's consultation, the Quartermaster Corps issued their initial specifications. If you like this video, please like, comment about your thoughts on this, subscribe and click the bell icon for further notifications.